An empty bed, a window left ajar, and a silence that has shrouded the Algarve region of Portugal for nearly 20 years. But suddenly, that terrifying silence was broken by a voice from Poland asserting, "I am that missing girl." 69% that is the haunting figure that made the entire world hold its breath. Could a young woman possessing the rare defect in her eye truly be the missing piece of the most famous cold case of the 21st century? Or is this merely another cruel illusion nurtured by the chaos of social media? From a German suspect living in a mysterious camper van to the shocking DNA results from a laboratory in the United States, today we are not simply retelling an old story. We are peeling back the layers of truth behind the most controversial theories. Before we step into this special file, please take a single second to click the like and subscribe buttons below. Your support is the fuel that allows us to continue this journey for justice. And now, let us travel back in time to that fateful night. The setting of false security. The Algarve region of Portugal has long been regarded as a premier destination for European travelers. Known for its pristine coastline and a pervasive sense of tranquility, it was in this setting, specifically within an exclusive resort in Praia da Luz, that a vacation began nearly 2 decades ago, which would eventually spark one of the most extensive investigations in modern history. The resort was marketed as a secure sanctuary, a place where families could relax within the confines of a protected environment. This perception of safety is a critical element in understanding the events that unfolded, as it likely contributed to the decisions made by the group of adults involved. Analysts looking back at the case often point to the psychological bubble that exclusive resorts create. Guests frequently lower their guard, believing that the exclusivity of the location acts as a barrier against external threats. However, as this case would tragically demonstrate, perimeter fences and security patrols are not always impermeable. The dinner routine and the rotation system. On the evening in question, the parents of the missing daughter joined a group of friends for dinner. This group, later referred to in media reports as the Tapas 7, chose to dine at a restaurant located within the resort complex. The logistical arrangement of the evening has been a focal point of scrutiny for years. The restaurant was situated a short distance from the apartments where the group was staying, allowing the adults to implement a checking system. Rather than hiring a sitter, they established a rotation schedule where members of the group would take turns leaving the table to check on the sleeping individuals in their respective apartments. From an investigative standpoint, this rotation system is significant because it established a timeline of movement. It created a series of small, unmonitored windows of time. Criminologists analyzing the case suggest that this pattern of behavior, adults moving back and forth between the dining area and the apartments, could have been observed by a third party. If a perpetrator had been watching the apartment block, the regularity of these checks might have provided the necessary data to calculate exactly how much time was available to enter the premises undetected. This theory aligns with the hypothesis that the disappearance was not a crime of opportunity, but a calculated act. The discovery of the empty bed. The routine continued without incident during the early part of the evening. However, during one of these scheduled checks, the situation shifted from a mundane vacation evening to a breaking news event. The mother of the missing daughter returned to the apartment to conduct her visual inspection. Upon entering the room, she discovered that the bed where her daughter had been sleeping was empty. The immediate physical evidence at the scene presented a disturbing narrative. The mother reported that the window to the room was open, or specifically, semi-open. This detail is paramount to the investigation. The existence of an open window suggested a clear point of entry or exit. It challenged the initial hope that the daughter might have simply wandered off, directing the narrative immediately toward the possibility of an abduction. The open window detail has been debated intensely in the years following the event. Some skeptics and investigators question whether a window could be opened from the outside without leaving significant forensic traces, while others argued that an intruder fleeing the scene would use the window as the quickest escape route. The German suspect connection. While the initial investigation focused heavily on the immediate surroundings and the timeline of the parents, retrospective analysis has brought a significant person of interest into the spotlight. Years after the event, it was revealed that a German national named Christian Brückner was in the Algarve region during this specific time frame. Reports indicate that this individual was living a transient lifestyle, residing in a camper van and navigating the coast. The geographical proximity of this suspect to the resort is a detail that cannot be overlooked. Investigations placed him near the location for more than a month around the time the disappearance occurred. This fact reshapes the understanding of the security at the resort. It suggests that while the guests felt isolated from the outside world, the perimeter was porous enough for a non-guest, specifically someone with a camper van, to be loitering nearby without drawing immediate suspicion from security personnel. The theory that emerged involves this individual potentially scouting the location. Investigators have considered the possibility that he observed the open window or the pattern of the parents' dinner rotation and decided to act. The chaos of the golden hour. In missing person cases, the first 60 minutes, often called the golden hour, are crucial for preserving evidence and establishing a perimeter. In this instance, the transition from discovery to police containment was chaotic. The alarm was raised, and the search began immediately. But the preservation of the crime scene was reportedly less than ideal, with friends, resort staff, and eventually local police entering and exiting the apartment. The integrity of potential forensic evidence was compromised. This contamination becomes relevant when discussing later forensic breakthroughs or the lack thereof. For example, years later, when advanced DNA testing became a possibility, the samples available were often degraded or mixed. This is a common challenge in high-profile cases, where panic overrides protocol. The immediate search was frantic, driven by the hope that the daughter had simply walked out and was lost in the complex. It was only as the hours passed without a sighting that the reality of a potential crime set in. Suspicions turned inward. A controversial and painful aspect of this case was the shift in focus by the authorities toward the parents themselves. Both parents were medical professionals, a fact that led to wild and unsubstantiated theories in the media and among some investigators. At one stage, the local police formally named them as arguidos, or suspects. The hypothesis, pursued by some detectives, was that the disappearance was accidental and that the parents had covered it up. To support this theory, authorities scrutinized a vehicle, a Renault Scenic, that the parents had rented weeks after the disappearance. Forensic teams dismantled parts of this vehicle looking for biological traces. The relentless pressure on the parents during this period was immense. They were grieving the loss of their daughter while simultaneously fighting a legal and public relations battle to prove their innocence. Retrospective documentaries and reports have largely dismantled the theory of parental involvement, with viewers and experts often concluding that the parents were victims of a tunnel vision investigation. However, the time and resources spent investigating the family arguably allowed the real perpetrator, if there was one, to increase the distance between themselves and the crime scene. The global ripples. The disappearance did not stay a local Portuguese news story for long. It rapidly mutated into a global phenomenon. Images of the missing daughter were broadcast across the world, making her face one of the most recognizable in history. Specifically, the public was urged to look for a distinctive physical trait, a defect in the iris of her eye, often described as a bleed or a spot. This detail became a key identifier. The widespread dissemination of her image led to a flood of reported sightings. People claimed to have seen her in Morocco, South Africa, and even as far away as Chile. In Chile, a report surfaced of a young female matching the description, highlighting the global reach of the case. While these sightings were born out of a collective desire to help, they also complicated the investigation. Police resources had to be diverted to verify leads on multiple continents. This phenomenon illustrates the double-edged sword of high-profile media coverage. It ensures the case is never forgotten, but it also generates a volume of noise that can drown out credible leads. Analysis of the initial failure. Reviewing the first chapter of this saga, the narrative is one of missed opportunities and systemic failures. The resort's security was insufficient to prevent an intrusion. The parents' checking system, while well-intentioned, left a fatal gap in supervision. The police response, hampered by cross-border communication issues and a lack of immediate scene preservation, failed to utilize the golden hour effectively. And finally, the distraction caused by focusing on the parents may have wasted critical time. As the sun rose over the Algarve the following morning, the reality was stark. The bed was empty, the window was open, and a mystery had begun that would haunt the world for decades. The search for the truth was only just beginning. And as we will see in later chapters, it would take twists involving German prisoners, Polish claimants, and advanced DNA science before the world could even begin to understand the complexity of what happened that night. The critical first 60 minutes. In the lexicon of criminal investigations, the term golden hour refers to the period immediately following the report of a crime, typically the first 60 minutes. This window is considered vital because it is when evidence is freshest, memories are sharpest, and the likelihood of apprehending a perpetrator is at its highest. In the case of the disappearance in the Algarve, analysts and criminologists have long debated whether this crucial window was utilized effectively or squandered in confusion. When the alarm was raised, the immediate reaction was one of frantic searching rather than forensic containment. Reports from the night indicate that before law enforcement could establish a sterile perimeter, multiple individuals, including staff and friends of the family, had entered and exited the apartment. From a forensic standpoint, this traffic is catastrophic. Every person who walked through the scene potentially introduced new DNA or obliterated existing traces. The preservation of the crime scene, a fundamental tenet of police work, appeared to be compromised from the outset. This lack of initial control would later become a significant hurdle for forensic teams attempting to isolate the DNA of a potential intruder from the background noise of the resort's occupants. The arrival of authorities and cultural clashes. The local Portuguese authorities, the Polícia Judiciária, assumed control of the investigation. However, the early stages were marked by a tangible friction between the local investigative protocols and the expectations of the British family and media. Observers noted a disconnect in communication styles and procedural transparency. The local police tended to operate with a high degree of secrecy, a standard practice in their judicial system, which often safeguards the integrity of an ongoing inquiry. In contrast, the family and the British press were accustomed to a more public-facing style of policing, where appeals for information are broadcast rapidly. This cultural and procedural clash complicated the flow of information. Critics argue that the local police were too slow to distribute descriptions of potential suspects or vehicles, while defenders of the police force suggest that the immediate media circus created by the family's entourage hindered their ability to work methodically. This tension created a chaotic environment where the investigation was being fought on two fronts: the physical search on the ground and the battle for the narrative in the press. The media strategy. A double-edged sword. Recognizing that the local search might not yield immediate results, the parents made a decisive strategic move. They mobilized the media. Almost overnight, the disappearance transformed from a regional news item into a global phenomenon. This was not an accidental viral moment, but a calculated effort to ensure the case remained in the public eye. The rationale was clear: if the daughter had been taken across borders, international awareness was the only hope of recovery. The campaign was unprecedented in its scale. Images of the missing daughter were beamed into living rooms across Europe, the Americas, and beyond. In countries as far away as Chile, citizens reported seeing the face of the missing girl on television and in newspapers. The saturation was absolute. While this strategy successfully galvanized the world, ensuring that millions of eyes were looking for the missing individual, media analysts point out the collateral damage of such an approach. The overwhelming volume of coverage led to a flood of false sightings and noise that overwhelmed investigators. Every blonde female of a certain age, seen in an airport or a town square, became a potential lead, draining police resources as they chased down thousands of dead ends. The mark of identity. The defect in the eye central to this media campaign was a specific, unalterable physical detail. The missing daughter possessed a rare condition known as a coloboma distinct dark smear, or defect in the iris of her right eye. This mark became the focal point of the search. It was a physical identifier that could not be easily disguised, unlike hair color or clothing. The emphasis on the eye defect was a masterstroke in terms of public identification. It gave the public a concrete detail to look for, moving beyond a generic description of a young girl. Years later, when new claimants emerged suggesting they might be the missing daughter, this eye defect remained the primary litmus test for credibility. For instance, when the Polish national Julia Wendel later claimed to be the missing individual, her assertion relied heavily on her having a similar mark in her eye, a detail she highlighted to her followers on social media. The persistence of this specific detail in the public consciousness demonstrates the power of the initial media campaign. Nearly 2 decades later, the world still remembered the eye, from sympathy to suspicion. As the weeks turned into months, the media narrative began to shift. The initial wave of universal sympathy for the parents slowly gave way to scrutiny. This transition is a common phenomenon in prolonged missing person cases, where the public's inability to resolve the mystery leads to skepticism toward those closest to the center. The parents, both medical professionals, found their behavior analyzed by armchair detectives and journalists alike. The investigation took a dramatic turn when the focus of the inquiries pivoted toward the family. The parents were eventually named as arguidos, or formal suspects, a status that allowed police to ask more direct and incriminating questions. This shift was fueled partly by the lack of evidence pointing to an intruder, and partly by forensic interpretations that were later contested. Specifically, investigators focused on a rental car Renault Scenic that the parents had hired weeks after the disappearance. Forensic teams dismantled parts of this vehicle in a search for biological material, theorizing that it might have been used to transport the daughter. The media, which had built the parents up as tragic figures, now eagerly consumed the narrative of their potential involvement. Documentaries produced years later capture this volatile swing in public opinion, showing how viewers would oscillate between believing in the parents' innocence and suspecting their guilt based on the tone of the latest news report. Despite the intense scrutiny and the resources poured into investigating the parents, no definitive biological evidence was ever found to substantiate the theory that they harmed their daughter. The psychological toll and the vacuum of truth, the golden hour, had long passed, and the media storm had ravaged the lives of everyone involved. The parents wrote books and gave interviews to maintain the search, but they also faced the harsh reality of a public trial without a court. The intense exposure meant that their grief was public property, analyzed for authenticity. From an analytical perspective, the media storm achieved its primary goal. The case was never forgotten. However, it also created a complex legacy. The saturation of information meant that facts were often inextricably mixed with speculation. The official narrative became a patchwork of police theories, media sensation, and public rumor. As the investigation dragged on without a body or a confession, the media vacuum was filled with new theories, new suspects, and eventually, new individuals claiming to be the lost daughter. The failure to secure the scene in those first 60 minutes, combined with the uncontrollable force of the global media, ensured that the truth would remain obscured by a fog of conflicting stories for decades to come. A case that refused to close. By the end of the initial investigative phase, the case had established itself as a modern enigma. It was no longer just a police matter. It was a cultural event. The image of the daughter with the defect in her eye was etched into the global psyche. The failure to find her in the immediate aftermath meant that the search would expand into a marathon, spanning years and borders. The stage was set for a long, grueling saga that would eventually pull in characters from Germany and Poland, testing the limits of forensic science and international cooperation. The world watched and waited, but the silence of that first night in the Algarve remained unbroken. The pivot inward. As the weeks turned into months, The investigation into the disappearance in the Algarve underwent a dramatic and controversial shift. Initially, the resources of the local police and international agencies were directed outward, scouring the landscape for a potential abductor. However, as leads evaporated and physical evidence of an intruder remained elusive, the investigative gaze turned inward. In the history of criminal justice, it is a statistical reality that authorities often look to the immediate family when a person vanishes from a secure environment. In this specific case, that procedural pivot resulted in the parents being designated as arguidos, a specific legal status in the Portuguese system that translates to formal suspects. This development marked a significant turning point in the narrative. The couple, who had previously been viewed by the global public as victims of a terrible tragedy, suddenly found themselves the subject of intense scrutiny. Legal analysts observing the case have frequently commented on the psychological devastation of this status. The individuals were not only processing the loss of their daughter, but were also forced to mount a legal defense to protect their own liberty. The medical hypothesis. A primary factor that fueled the suspicion against the parents was their professional background. Both individuals were qualified physicians. This detail, while seemingly irrelevant to a kidnapping, became the cornerstone of a specific investigative theory. Detectives began to explore the possibility that the disappearance was not an abduction, but rather an accident that had been covered up. The working hypothesis that emerged in the media and police files suggested that the parents, in an effort to ensure their daughters slept through the night while they dined with friends, might have administered a sedative or medication. The theory posited that an error in dosage or a reaction to the medication led to an accidental fatality, which was subsequently concealed. While this narrative was purely theoretical and lacked a confession, it gained traction because it offered a logical explanation for the lack of forced entry. Commentators have noted that this medical theory played into the public's fascination with the idea of a perfect crime committed by intelligent, capable professionals. However, despite the intense investigation into this angle, no toxicological evidence or physical proof was ever produced to substantiate the claim that medication had been administered. The mystery of the Renault Scenic. The scrutiny of the parents eventually coalesced around a specific piece of physical property, a silver Renault Scenic. This vehicle had been rented by the couple, but crucially, it was hired several weeks after the disappearance occurred. The timeline is significant here. For the parents to be involved using this car, they would have had to conceal the body of the victim for weeks before moving a logistical challenge that many criminologists argue would be nearly impossible in a resort swarming with police and media. Nevertheless, the vehicle became a primary crime scene. Forensic teams seized the car and conducted an exhaustive search for biological material. Reports indicate that the vehicle was practically dismantled in the hunt for DNA or fluids that could link the missing daughter to the car's interior. The investigation utilized highly trained sniffer dogs, animals specifically conditioned to detect the scent of human remains and microscopic traces of blood. While there were reports of the dogs reacting to areas within the vehicle, the subsequent forensic analysis in the laboratory failed to provide a definitive DNA match that could stand up in court. The science of transfer DNA, where genetic material is moved from person to object, became a central debate. Defense experts argued that any DNA found could easily have been transferred via the parents' clothing or belongings, rather than proving the presence of a body. The trial by media and public opinion. The designation of the parents as suspects triggered a volatile reaction in the court of public opinion. Documentaries and news reports produced in the years following the event illustrate how fluid the public narrative became. One segment of a documentary might present compelling circumstantial arguments that led viewers to suspect the parents, only for the next segment to dismantle those theories and point towards police incompetence. This oscillation of opinion highlights a phenomenon often referred to as trial by media. The parents were subjected to a level of intrusion that few have ever experienced. Their body language was analyzed by self-proclaimed experts. Their lack of public tears on certain occasions was interpreted as coldness rather than shock. and their decision to leave the children alone to dine nearby was condemned as negligence. Yet, as time passed, the narrative shifted again. The lack of concrete evidence, no body, no murder weapon, and no confession caused the pendulum to swing back toward innocence. The parents eventually wrote a book detailing their experience, attempting to reclaim their own story from the headlines. The collapse of the case against the family, ultimately, the case against the parents could not be sustained. The Portuguese Attorney General's office eventually archived the case, lifting the arguido status due to a lack of evidence. The investigation had exhausted vast resources pursuing the theory of parental involvement, a detour that many critics argue wasted precious time that could have been spent tracking external threats. From an analytical perspective, this chapter of the investigation serves as a cautionary tale about tunnel vision. By focusing so heavily on the parent-SA strategy, often referred to as confirmation bias, authorities may have inadvertently allowed other leads to go cold. The parents were super-investigated, their lives turned inside out, yet the fundamental question remained unanswered. If they did not do it, then an intruder had successfully entered and exited the apartment without leaving a trace, a reality that was far more terrifying for the general public to accept. The clearance of the parents did not bring closure. It merely reset the board, leaving the investigators back at square one, looking for a ghost in the Algarve night. The globalization of a search following the media saturation described in previous chapters, the investigation into the disappearance in the Algarve ceased to be a localized European inquiry and rapidly expanded into a worldwide phenomenon. The sheer volume of press coverage meant that the image of the missing daughter was distributed to virtually every corner of the globe. This unprecedented dissemination of information created a unique investigative environment where the general public effectively became an extension of the police force. From an analytical standpoint, this mass mobilization is often viewed as a triumph of modern communication. Within days, individuals in remote locations were aware of the case. However, this global awareness brought with it a complex logistical challenge. As the image of the missing individual permeated the collective consciousness, law enforcement agencies began receiving a deluge of reports from citizens claiming to have seen her. These sightings were not confined to Portugal or neighboring Spain, but spanned continents, creating a chaotic map of potential leads that stretched from North Africa to South America. The Mirage in Morocco and beyond, one of the earliest and most persistent regions for reported sightings, was Morocco. Given its geographical proximity to the Iberian Peninsula, it was a logical location for investigators to consider if the individual had been transported across the border. Reports flooded in from tourists and locals alike, claiming to have spotted a young female matching the description in markets, on streets, and in vehicles. This phenomenon was not unique to North Africa. Similar reports emerged from South Africa and various nations in Latin America. In each instance, the pattern was strikingly similar. A well-meaning observer would notice a blonde female who bore a superficial resemblance to the widely circulated photographs. Driven by a desire to assist, they would contact authorities. While these actions were rooted in empathy and vigilance, they often resulted in significant diversion of investigative resources. Detectives were forced to liaise with international counterparts, navigating diplomatic channels and language barriers to verify or dismiss leads that were thousands of miles apart. The connection in Chile. Perhaps one of the most remarkable examples of the case's global reach occurred in Chile. It is a testament to the power of the media campaign that citizens in a nation so far removed from the crime scene were actively looking for the missing daughter. Reports surfaced of a sighting in Chile, where witnesses believed they had identified the missing individual. This specific incident highlights the Elvis sighting effect often seen in high-profile cases, where the subject becomes so iconic that the human brain begins to project their image onto strangers. In the Chilean case, as in many others, photographs were taken and submitted to authorities. These images typically depicted young females who shared general characteristics: light hair, fair skin, but lacked the specific forensic identifiers necessary for a positive match. The global nature of these reports, including the specific instance in Chile, underscores how the mystery had captivated the world, turning a local tragedy into an international puzzle. The eye, as the ultimate identifier. Amidst the thousands of false leads and hopeful sightings, investigators relied on one immutable physical trait to filter the noise: the defect in the right eye. As noted in earlier reports, the missing daughter possessed a coloboma, a distinct dark mark on the iris. This physical anomaly became the primary tool for ruling out potential matches. When photographs from purported sightings were analyzed, forensic experts would immediately zoom in on the eyes. In almost every case, including the high-profile reports from overseas, the distinct mark was absent. The eye defect served as a biological barcode, a unique identifier that could not be easily faked or coincidental. Authorities noted that while general resemblance was common, the specific combination of facial features and the eye defect was exceedingly rare. This reliance on the eye mark was crucial for maintaining focus. Without it, the investigation might have collapsed under the weight of thousands of look-alike reports. The psychology of collective wishful thinking, the phenomenon of seeing the missing daughter in multiple countries simultaneously, can be attributed to what psychologists call collective wishful thinking, or pareidolia tendency to perceive a specific, meaningful image in a random or ambiguous visual pattern. Because the public desperately wanted the story to have a resolution, and specifically a resolution where the victim was found alive, their minds were primed to spot her. This psychological state created a feedback loop. Every time a new sighting was reported in the news, it validated the hope that she was still out there, prompting even more people to look. While this kept the case alive, it also meant that the investigation was constantly chasing shadows. Photographs of innocent children and adolescents were circulated and scrutinized, raising ethical questions about the privacy of those who happened to resemble the missing individual. The legacy of the global search. Looking back at this phase of the investigation, the global sightings represent both the best and worst of the public's involvement. On one hand, it demonstrated a profound human capacity for empathy. People in Chile, South Africa, and beyond genuinely cared about the fate of a stranger. On the other hand, it revealed the limitations of crowdsourced investigations. The sheer volume of false positives created a needle in a haystack scenario where the haystack was constantly growing. The investigation eventually had to pivot back to hard science and credible leads, as the trail of global sightings led largely to dead ends. However, the files remain full of these reports, thousands of moments where someone, somewhere, thought they had solved the mystery. As we move forward in the narrative, we will see how this desperate need for identification would later evolve from random sightings into specific individuals claiming to be the missing daughter herself, bringing a new dimension of complexity to the search for identity. A new focal point. After years of following leads that spanned continents from the Atlas Mountains in Morocco to the streets of South American investigators eventually circled back to the geographical origin of the mystery. The Algarve itself. While the global sightings described in the previous chapter were fueled by well-intentioned public vigilance, a far more ominous and concrete lead was developing within the criminal justice system. This lead focused on a German national, identified in reports as Christian Brückner, whose presence in the region during the critical time frame has since become the cornerstone of the modern investigation. For nearly a decade and a half, the narrative of the disappearance was dominated by theories of opportunistic wanderers or the parents' involvement. However, the emergence of this suspect shifted the investigative paradigm. Authorities revealed that this individual was not merely a transient tourist passing through. He had established a significant footprint in the area. Reports indicate that he had been loitering around the resort in Praia de Luz for more than a month prior to the event. This duration suggests a level of familiarity with the environment that aligns with the theory of a premeditated act rather than a random crime of opportunity. The camper van and the transient life. A key element of this suspect's profile was his mode of living. He resided in a camper van house on wheels which allowed him to move freely along the Portuguese coast. This mobility is a critical detail for criminologists analyzing the case. A suspect living in a vehicle possesses the ability to monitor a target location like a resort and then rapidly leave the area without the logistical trail left by hotel bookings or flight manifests. This van life aspect also complicates the retrospective investigation. Unlike a permanent resident, a transient individual can easily slip through the cracks of a local census or police checks. Retrospective analysis of his movements places him dangerously close to the apartment where the disappearance occurred. Investigators believe that his vehicle allowed him to blend into the background of the tourist-heavy region, making him virtually invisible to security personnel who were looking for obvious threats, rather than a seemingly mundane camper parked nearby. The prison confession. The breakthrough connecting this German national to the case did not come from DNA found at the scene, but rather from human intelligence. The suspect is currently incarcerated in a German prison, though notably, he is serving time for crimes unrelated to this disappearance. It was within the confines of the prison system that a critical piece of information allegedly surfaced. Reports suggest that while interacting with a fellow inmate, the suspect made incriminating statements claiming responsibility for the abduction and the ultimate fate of the missing daughter. This alleged confession ignited a renewed fervor in the investigation. It provided a direct link that had been missing for years. However, legal analysts urge caution when evaluating statements made by inmates while incarcerated. While they can be pivotal, they are also subject to intense scrutiny in court, as the credibility of the witness often another criminal can be easily attacked. Nevertheless, this testimony was significant enough to prompt German prosecutors to publicly classify him as the primary suspect in the disappearance. A history of offenses. To understand the gravity of this lead, one must look at the suspect's criminal history. He is described as a person of interest with a documented history of significant legal violations. At present, he is behind bars for a serious offense committed against a senior citizen in the same region of Portugal. This detail is harrowing, as it establishes his capacity for violence against vulnerable individuals within that specific geographical area. The fact that he targeted a woman of advanced age in the same vicinity demonstrates a predatory pattern that disregards the age or strength of the victim. It dispels the notion that he was a specialist who only targeted one demographic, painting him instead as an opportunistic predator. Furthermore, investigations into his background revealed that he had connections to a wider network of illicit activities, although he has remained silent regarding the specific location or fate of the missing daughter. He has never revealed what happened to her, maintaining a silence that frustrates investigators to this day. The search for physical evidence. Following the renewal of interest in this suspect, authorities conducted searches of properties associated with him. One notable location was a house where he had resided, which reportedly contained a hidden cellar or tunnel-like structure. Forensic teams excavated these sites in hopes of finding biological remains or personal effects that could definitively link him to the disappearance. These searches, often conducted years after the fact, faced the immense challenge of time. Soil shifts, structures change, and evidence degrades. While the existence of concealed spaces in his residence adds a layer of suspicion, suggesting a lifestyle involving hiding and secrecy, definitive physical evidence has yet been released to the public that conclusively solves the case. The impending release and legal urgent. A sense of urgency currently permeates this phase of the investigation. Legal reports indicate that the suspect could potentially be released from prison as early as the year 2025. This looming date creates a high-stakes race against time for prosecutors. If he is released before charges can be formally brought regarding the disappearance, there is a fear that he could vanish once again, putting him beyond the reach of justice. This situation highlights the complexities of cross-border justice. The suspect is a German national. The crime occurred in Portugal, and the victim was British. This trifecta involves 3 different legal systems, 3 different police forces, and 3 different sets of laws regarding evidence and statutes of limitations. The coordination required is monumental. As we look toward the next developments, the question remains. Will the collective efforts of these nations be enough to build a watertight case before the clock runs out, or will the German lead become another unresolved chapter in this enduring mystery? The digital resurgence of a cold case. For nearly 2 decades, the investigation into the disappearance in the Algarve had moved through various phases. The initial chaotic search, the scrutiny of the parents, the global sightings, and the focus on the German suspect. However, in recent times, the narrative was seized by a force that did not exist when the event first occurred. The power of viral social media. The case, which had largely become a matter of police files and occasional documentaries, was suddenly thrust back into the daily news cycle by a young woman living in Poland. This new chapter began not in a police station, but on the platform Instagram. A profile emerged under the handle that translated to "I am the missing girl," managed by a young woman named Julia Wendel, also referred to in some reports as Julia Wandelt or Faustina. Unlike previous sightings which were reported by third-party observers, this was a first-person claim. Julia directly addressed the global public, asserting her belief that she was the long-lost daughter from the United Kingdom, the claimant. Julia Wendel, Julia, presented herself as a young woman with a clouded past. She stated that she was adopted and lived in Poland, but she harbored deep uncertainties about her true identity. Her narrative was compelling to millions of followers because it tapped into the unresolved grief of the original case. She claimed that she did not have access to her original birth certificate and that her childhood memories were fragmented or non-existent, a psychological state that she argued was consistent with early childhood trauma and displacement. Analysts observing this phenomenon noted that Julia's age estimated to be around 21 years old at the time of her claims, roughly aligned with the age the missing daughter would have been. However, discrepancies were immediately noted by skeptics, as Julia's official documents suggested she was slightly older, perhaps 23. Julia countered this by suggesting that her age could have been altered by those who raised her to conceal her true identity. The visual evidence. The eye and the leg. What made Julia's claim resonate more than thousands of previous theories was her presentation of physical evidence. She did not just offer a story. She offered side-by-side photographic comparisons. The centerpiece of her argument was the distinctive eye defect. As established in the forensic profile of the missing daughter, a coloboma rare dark strip on the iris was the primary identifier. Julia posted high-resolution images of her own face, circling a defect in her eye that she claimed was identical to the one in the police sketches. In addition to the eye, Julia pointed to other physical markers. She showcased a specific mark on her leg, which she argued matched the description of a mark found on the missing daughter. Furthermore, she drew attention to facial features such as her teeth and the shape of her mouth, urging her audience to compare them with age progression images created by forensic artists. The visual similarities were striking enough to divide public opinion. While experts remained cautious, the internet was ablaze with speculation. For a brief moment, a significant portion of the online community believed that the mystery had finally been solved. The viral storm and public reaction. The reaction to Julia's account was instantaneous and overwhelming. Her follower count skyrocketed into the millions within days. This viral storm forced the hand of traditional media and law enforcement. News outlets that had not covered the case in years began running segments analyzing Julia's facial features and her backstory. This phase of the case highlighted a shift in how modern investigations unfold. It was no longer a top-down process, where police released information to the public. It was a bottom-up pressure campaign, where the public demanded that police investigate a social media lead. Commentators on the case have pointed out that this pressure can be both beneficial and detrimental. It ensures that no stone is left unturned, but it also exposes vulnerable individuals to intense harassment. Julia reported that while she received support, she also faced a barrage of online abuse and threats from those who believed she was a fraud seeking attention. Analysis. The psychology of identity. From an analytical perspective, Julia's story is a profound case study in the search for identity. whether or not she was the missing daughter. Her distress appeared genuine to many observers. She was a young woman who felt disconnected from her own history, seeking answers in the face of a family in Poland that she claimed was uncooperative. The situation also placed the parents of the missing daughter in an agonizing position. They had to weigh the emotional cost of engaging with yet another false lead against the slim possibility that this could be the breakthrough they had prayed for. Reports indicate that while they did not speak publicly to avoid a media circus, they were aware of the claims and remained cautiously distant, having had their hopes dashed countless times before. A global audience waiting for science. As Julia continued to post updates, the debate moved from the comments section to the laboratory. The consensus was clear. Visual comparisons on Instagram were not proof. The only way to resolve the dispute was through genetic testing. Julia publicly demanded a DNA test, initially asking the parents of the missing daughter to participate, and later focusing on her own ancestry. This chapter of the saga set the stage for a definitive scientific showdown. The world watched as a young woman from Poland challenged the narrative of one of the most famous cold cases in history, armed only with a smartphone and a conviction that she was not who her documents said she was. The transition from internet speculation to forensic reality was imminent, and the results, as we will see, would have profound implications for everyone involved. The blank slate of memory. As the world turned its attention to the claims emerging from Poland, the narrative moved beyond physical similarities, the eyes and the legs, and into the psychological realm of memory. Julia Wendel's assertion that she was the missing daughter was not based solely on biological markers, but also on a profound and disturbing void in her own history. In a series of public statements and interviews, she described her past as a blank slate, stating that she possessed almost no recollection of her life before a certain point in her development. This phenomenon of erased memory became a central pillar of her testimony. She reported to her growing audience that her childhood memories were not merely faded, which is common for many adults, but completely absent. She described a sensation of frustration and confusion, noting that when she attempted to recall specific events, holidays, or milestones from her early years, she was met with silence. For investigative psychologists analyzing her statements, this total amnesia regarding one's origins is often a red flag. It can suggest deep-seated trauma, a dissociation from reality, or, in the context of a missing person case, the possibility that a previous identity had been suppressed, the missing photographic record. To substantiate her feelings of displacement, Julia pointed to a tangible lack of evidence within her own family home. In the digital age, and even in the era of film photography that preceded it, family histories are typically documented through images. However, Julia claimed that her personal archive was incomplete. Specifically, she asserted that she could not find any photographs of herself from the period spanning her birth up to approximately 6 years of age. This detail struck a chord with observers. The absence of baby photos, first steps, or early birthday celebrations is highly unusual in a standard family unit. When she inquired about these missing images, Julia alleged that her parents, or the people she knew as her parents, offered evasive answers, simply stating that they did not have them. From an investigative standpoint, the lack of a photographic trail is a critical anomaly. It raises the question: was there a deliberate effort to curate her history, effectively starting her life narrative at a later date to conceal her true origins? Or, as skeptics argued, was this merely a case of lost albums or a family that simply did not prioritize photography? The question of age and documentation. The uncertainty surrounding Julia's identity extended to the most fundamental of official records, her birth certificate. Julia claimed that she had never seen her original birth certificate and, as a result, harbored serious doubts about her actual age. While her official documents in Poland listed a specific date of birth, she publicly questioned their authenticity. She suggested that she might be younger than her papers indicated, a discrepancy that she believed would align her age with that of the missing daughter from the Algarve. This skepticism regarding age is a common theme in cases of abduction or illegal adoption, where falsified documents are often created to legitimize a child's new identity. Julia stated that when she contacted authorities to verify her age, she was told she was 21 years old. Yet the ambiguity remained. The lack of accessible medical records from her early years further fueled the mystery. Without a verified hospital record of her birth or early pediatric care, her timeline remained fluid, allowing the theory that she was the missing daughter to persist despite the skepticism of legal experts. Confronting the silence at home. The conflict over Julia's identity was not just played out on social media. It sparked a volatile domestic dispute. Julia recounted multiple attempts to confront her mother and grandmother about her suspicions. She described asking them directly if they were her biological parents, seeking reassurance or proof of her lineage. However, instead of clarity, she reported facing hostility. According to Julia, her mother would become visibly angry when the topic was raised, often shutting down the conversation or diverting the subject entirely. Julia claimed her mother would say that the past is the past and that they should focus on the future, refusing to delve into the details of her early life. This reaction was interpreted by Julianne by thousands of her followers as a sign of guilt or concealment. Why would a parent refuse to discuss a child's infancy unless there was something to hide? Analysts, however, offer an alternative perspective. It is possible that the family's anger stemmed from the pain of being accused of a crime by their own daughter. For a family that may have raised a young person through difficult circumstances, the public denial of their biological bond could be seen as a deep betrayal, explaining the emotional volatility and the refusal to engage with her investigation. Psychological analysis. Repressed trauma or false narrative. The erased past narrative invites a complex psychological evaluation. Experts in memory formation note that while childhood amnesia, the inability to remember events before age 3 or 4, is normal, a total void extending into the schoolage years is less common. Trauma specialists suggest that severe stress or displacement can cause a person to block out entire blocks of time as a defense mechanism. If Julia had indeed experienced a traumatic abduction or a difficult adoption process, her brain might have walled off those memories to protect her. Conversely, there is the phenomenon of the false narrative. In the absence of information, the human mind often seeks to fill the gaps. A young person feeling disconnected or different from their family might unconsciously latch onto a high-profile story like the disappearance in the Algarvias, a way to explain their feelings of alienation. The missing memories become a canvas upon which a new, more significant identity is painted. Julia herself admitted to having limited recollections and feeling strange about her history. This ambiguity created a fertile ground for the belief that she was not who she was told she was. The burden of proof. Ultimately, the claims of an erased past served to deepen the mystery but offered no concrete proof. The lack of photos and documents is circumstantial evidence. It creates suspicion but does not confirm a crime. In a court of law, or in the rigorous standards of forensic science, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The fact that her family would note her could not produce baby photos did not prove she was the missing daughter from the United Kingdom. It only proved that her history was fragmented. This chapter of the saga highlights the tragedy of uncertain identity. Regardless of whether Julia was the missing individual, she was clearly a person in distress, searching for a foundation that felt solid. Her quest to find her real start in life forced the world to look at the investigation not just as a hunt for a perpetrator, but as a complex human drama about the need to know where we come from. The tension between her lived reality in Poland and the ghost of the past she believed she belonged to was reaching a breaking point, setting the stage for the intervention of international intermediaries, the domestic standoff. As the global interest in the case intensified, the focus of the investigation narrowed to a domestic dispute within Poland. Julia Wendel's quest for identity was not merely an online phenomenon. It was a real-world conflict played out within her family home. According to public statements and interviews given by Julia, The relationship with her family in Poland had deteriorated significantly as her claims gained traction. She described an environment of secrecy and avoidance, where simple questions about her lineage were met with hostility rather than answers. Julia recounted specific interactions with her mother that raised eyebrows among observers. She stated that when she attempted to discuss the results of her ancestry or ask for childhood photographs, her mother would become visibly angry and attempt to change the subject immediately. This refusal to engage was interpreted by Julia and by a large segment of her online followings, an indication of guilt or concealment. The narrative emerging was one of a young woman hitting a wall of silence within her own home, fueling the theory that her true identity was being kept from her. The question of mental health, however, the family in Poland offered a starkly different perspective, albeit one communicated largely through silence and brief statements. Reports indicate that the family refused to participate in the media circus, citing Julia's history of mental health struggles as the root cause of the situation. Sources close to the family suggested that Julia had previously sought treatment for depression and other emotional difficulties. From this viewpoint, the refusal to provide DNA samples or engage with the investigation was not an act of hiding a kidnapped individual, but rather a refusal to indulge what they perceived as a delusion born of mental distress. They asserted that they held the relevant documents, proving her identity as their biological daughter, although they reportedly did not share these freely with the press. This clash of narrative zone of a cover-up and one of a mental health crisis created a complex ethical dilemma for the public. Were they witnessing a breakthrough in a criminal case, or the public unraveling of a vulnerable individual? The refusal to cooperate. The stalemate culminated in a refusal of cooperation from the Polish family regarding genetic testing. Despite Julia's public pleas for a DNA test to compare her genetic profile with that of her parents, they reportedly declined to provide samples. This decision was pivotal. In the eyes of online sleuths, an innocent family would have nothing to fear from a test that would quickly prove their biological connection. Conversely, privacy advocates argued that no family should be forced to submit their biological data to satisfy the demands of an internet mob. This chapter of the saga highlights the immense strain that high-profile missing person cases place on peripheral figures. The family in Poland, whether they were guardians of a dark secret or simply private citizens dealing with a domestic crisis, found themselves under the microscope of the international media. Their silence, intended to protect their privacy, inadvertently fueled the speculation that would drive the story to its next, more scientific phase. The emergence of a specific number, amidst the emotional turmoil and domestic arguments, a piece of scientific data emerged that sent shockwaves through the community following the case. Julia announced that she had received results from a preliminary analysis suggesting a genetic link to the parents of the missing daughter. Specifically, the figure 69% was circulated widely. Julia claimed that her DNA showed a 69% match with the father of the missing individual. To the layperson, and indeed to the media outlets that rapidly broadcast this figure, it sounded like a definitive confirmation. A match of over half seemed to imply a strong biological connection. The number was precise, suggesting a rigorous scientific process rather than a vague estimation. For a brief moment, it appeared that the mystery had been solved and that the young woman in Poland was indeed the lost daughter from the Algarve. Scientific misinterpretation and skepticism. However, as the dust settled, experts began to deconstruct what this number actually meant. In the complex world of genealogy and DNA testing, a percentage match does not always equate to a direct parent-child relationship. Geneticists pointed out that high percentages of shared DNA can exist between populations with similar ethnic backgrounds. If the test was measuring ancestry composition rather than a direct paternity marker, the 69% could simply reflect a shared regional heritage rather than a familial bond. Furthermore, the source of this DNA comparison was scrutinized. The investigation into the missing daughter had been ongoing for nearly 2 decades, and while the parents' DNA profiles were on file with law enforcement, It was unclear how an independent test in Poland could have accessed the official forensic data of the father for a direct comparison. This discrepancy raised questions about the validity of the test itself. Was it a legitimate forensic comparison, or was it a misunderstanding of a commercial ancestry report? The high hopes and the hard fall. Despite the skepticism from the scientific community, the impact of the 69% claim was undeniable. It renewed hope among those who desperately wanted a happy ending to the tragedy. It forced the world to consider the possibility that the impossible had happened, that the daughter had been found alive. This period of the investigation serves as a case study in the danger of interpreting raw data without context. The excitement generated by the number overshadowed the necessary caution. It showcased how quickly misinformation or misunderstood science can become fact in the digital age. The 69% figure became a headline, a hashtag, and a rallying cry, setting the stage for a definitive showdown that would require more than just preliminary numbers to resolve. The turn of the tide. As quickly as the internet had embraced Julia Wendell as a potential survivor, the tide of public opinion began to turn against her. The scrutiny of her claims, her past, and her motivations intensified. When the initial excitement faded and the questions about the validity of the DNA tests mounted, the supportive atmosphere shifted into one of hostility. Julia found herself at the center of a global backlash. Social media platforms, which had been the vehicle for her story, became arenas of judgment. Critics accused her of being a clout chaser, an individual seeking fame and followers by exploiting the tragedy of a grieving family. The anonymity of the internet allowed for a barrage of hateful comments, threats, and mockery. The young woman who had sought answers was now being branded a fraud before the final verdict was even in. The retreat from the public eye. The intensity of the negative attention took a toll. Reports indicate that the pressure became so overwhelming that Julia was forced to deactivate her social media accounts and retreat from the public eye. The investigation she had launched on Instagram had spiraled out of her control. She stated that she never intended to hurt anyone, least of all the family of the missing daughter, and that she genuinely just wanted to know who she was. This retreat marked a somber moment in the saga. It highlighted the human cost of viral fame. Whether Julia was right or wrong, she was a young person navigating a global storm without the infrastructure or support system to handle it. The backlash also served as a critique of the true crime community, which consumes these stories as entertainment. When the narrative became messy or uncomfortable, the audience turned on the protagonist. A community divided. The backlash effectively split the global audience into two camps. Those who viewed Julia as a victim of her own confusion and potential mental health struggles, and those who viewed her as a malicious actor. This division mirrored the complexities of the original case, where public opinion had previously been divided on the innocence of the parents. Analysts noted that the ferocity of the attacks on Julia was partly driven by a protective instinct toward the missing daughter. The public had invested years of emotional energy into the search, and the idea of someone faking it felt like a violation of that collective hope. This chapter of the narrative underscores the volatility of public sentiment and the dangers of conducting a sensitive investigation in the court of social media. Enter Fia Johansson. With the situation in Europe becoming untenable and the backlash reaching a fever pitch, a new figure entered the narrative. Fia Johansson. Described as a private investigator and a psychic medium, Johansson took on the role of Julia's representative and spokesperson. Her involvement marked a professionalization of Julia's chaotic quest. Johansson acted as a buffer between Julia and the media, managing the flow of information and attempting to steer the narrative back toward a search for truth. Johansson's entry into the case changed the geographical trajectory of the story. Recognizing that the environment in Poland was toxic and that definitive answers required advanced technology, she facilitated Julia's travel to the United States. This move was strategic. It removed Julia from the immediate pressure of her home country and placed her in a jurisdiction with access to some of the world's leading DNA laboratories. The media tour. In the United States, the story was elevated to a new level of media spectacle. Julia, accompanied by Johansson, appeared on major television platforms. These appearances were designed to present her case to a broader audience and, crucially, to put pressure on the scientific community to fast-track the DNA testing. During these interviews, the narrative was refined. The focus shifted away from the emotional outbursts and toward the what-if. Johansson argued that even if there was a 1% chance Julia was the missing daughter, it was a lead worth pursuing. This approach resonated with American audiences, who are culturally attuned to stories of miraculous reunions. However, critics argued that this media tour was exploitative, parading a vulnerable young woman on television for ratings. The wait for results. The ultimate goal of the American trip was the collection and analysis of DNA samples that would be processed by a reputable, independent laboratory. Unlike the preliminary or misunderstood tests from earlier in the story, this analysis would look at Julia's genetic heritage in its entirety. The weeks spent in the United States were a period of suspended animation for the case. The world waited. The debates on social media quieted down slightly as everyone acknowledged that speculation was futile in the face of impending hard science. Johansson provided updates, maintaining public interest, but the outcome remained uncertain. This chapter represents the calm before the storm. The final breath held before the truth, whatever it might be, was revealed. The final verdict. After weeks of speculation, travel, and media frenzy, the scientific results were finally released. The DNA analysis, conducted by independent experts in the United States, provided an answer that was absolute and indisputable. The results revealed that Julia Wendel's genetic heritage was 100% Polish, with some Lithuanian and Romanian influence. Crucially, the test showed absolutely no British ancestry. This biological fact was the final nail in the coffin of the theory. The missing daughter from the Algarve was British. If Julia had no British DNA, she could not be the missing individual. The science had spoken, and it dismantled the claim entirely. The collapse of the identity, the revelation, was a crushing blow to the narrative that had captivated millions. Julia was not the missing daughter. She was, as her documents had always stated, a young woman from Poland. The physical similarities, the eye, the leg, the smile, were determined to be coincidences, tricks of biology that had fueled a desperate hope. For Julia, this result was a profound personal crisis. She had invested her entire sense of self into the belief that she was someone else. Now, she was forced to confront the reality of her life in Poland, the bridges she had burned with her family, and the global ridicule she faced. She publicly stated that she never intended to deceive anyone and believed her own story, but the court of public opinion was unforgiving. A triumph for forensic truth. From an investigative standpoint, this chapter serves as a validation of forensic science. In an era of fake news and viral rumors, DNA remains the ultimate arbiter of identity. It cut through the noise, the emotion, and the theories, providing a cold, hard fact. The resolution of the Julia Wendel saga brought a sense of closure to this specific chapter. But it also left a bitter aftertaste. It was a reminder of the fragility of memory and identity. While it proved Julia was not the missing daughter, it did not bring the world any closer to finding out what actually happened in the Algarve nearly 20 years prior. The distraction was over, and the focus could now return to the silent, unresolved center of the case. Returning to the real investigation. With the distraction of the Polish claimant resolved, the investigative spotlight swung back to the only credible lead remaining, the German national, Christian Brückner. While the internet had been consumed by the drama of Julia Wendel, serious police work had continued in the background, focusing on this convicted offender, who is currently serving a sentence in a German prison for a separate crime. This individual remains the primary suspect for authorities in Germany. His profile aligns terrifyingly well with the circumstances of the disappearance. He was in the Algarve at the time, living a transient lifestyle in a camper van, and has a documented history of crimes against vulnerable individuals in that specific region. The ticking clock of justice. The current status of the investigation is defined by a race against time. The suspect is imprisoned for a severe physical assault against an elderly woman, but his sentence is not indefinite. Legal reports indicate that he could be eligible for release as early as the year 2025. This potential release date is a source of immense anxiety for investigators and the public alike. If he walks free before prosecutors can build a sufficient case to charge him with the disappearance of the British daughter, there is a very real fear that he will vanish again. The German authorities have been vocal about their belief that he is responsible, even stating they have evidence regarding the victim's tragic fate, yet they have not yet brought formal charges. The challenge of no body. The central hurdle remains the lack of physical remains. Without a body, proving murder is legally exceptionally difficult. The suspect has maintained his silence, refusing to provide the location of the victim or admit to the crime. This silence is his most powerful weapon. Analysts suggest that unless new physical evidence is found, perhaps in the reservoirs that have been searched or the properties that have been excavated, the case may remain in legal limbo. The suspect sits in his cell, a bogeyman who fits the puzzle perfectly, yet remains just out of reach of a final conviction for this specific crime. This chapter highlights the frustrating reality of the justice system. Knowing who likely committed a crime is very different from proving it in a court of law. The dignity of non-engagement. Throughout the entire saga involving Julia Wendell and the renewed media storm, two key figures remained notably absent from the noise. The parents of the missing daughter. Despite being the center of the story, they chose not to speak publicly, issue statements, or engage with the viral sensation. This silence was a strategic and emotional choice. Having been burned by false leads and media scrutiny for nearly 2 decades, the parents have learned to protect themselves from the emotional roller coaster of unverified claims. Analysts praised this restraint, noting that engaging with every claimant would only encourage more copycats and prolong their suffering. Their refusal to feed the media cycle demonstrated a profound resilience, the unending grief. While they did not speak, the toll of the events is unimaginable. To see a young woman on television claiming to be their daughter, recounting memories and showing evidence, must have been a unique form of psychological torture. Yet, they held firm, trusting in the official police channels rather than internet detectives. Reports suggest that the parents have never given up hope, but that hope is tempered by realism. They continue to mark the anniversaries. They continue to keep the fund for the search active, but they do so with a quiet dignity. They have rebuilt their lives, returned to their medical careers, and raised their other children, refusing to let the tragedy completely destroy their family unit. A legacy of resilience. The parents' role in this chapter is one of endurance. They serve as a reminder that at the heart of every true crime story are real people living with a void that can never be filled. Their silence spoke louder than the thousands of tweets and headlines. It was a statement that their daughter was not a character in a drama, but a real person who was missed every single day. The age progression today. The missing daughter would be in her early 20s. Forensic artists have created age progression images, showing what she might look like as a young adult. These images are haunting. They show a face that is familiar yet different, a ghost of a future that was stolen. These pictures are circulated periodically. A digital candle kept burning in the hope that someone, somewhere, might recognize the adult woman she could have become. The open wound. The case remains one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in modern history. It is an open wound not just for the family, but for the world. The sheer amount of resources, money, and time poured into this investigation is unprecedented. Yet, the fundamental questions remain. What happened that night? Who took her? Where is she now? The resolution of the Julia Wendell subplot proved that she was not the answer, but it did not bring us closer to the real answer. The German suspect remains the most viable lead, but without a confession or a body, he remains just a suspect. The enduring mystery. As we conclude this deep dive into the case, we are left with a sense of unease. The disappearance in the Algarve exposed the vulnerabilities of our safety, the flaws in our policing, and the chaotic power of our media. It showed us how the world can come together to search for one lost individual, but also how that search can be derailed by noise and false hope. The story is not over. As long as there is no body, there is a theoretical possibility of survival. As long as the suspect is alive, there is a possibility of a confession. And so, the world continues to watch and wait for the day when the silence of that night in Portugal is finally broken by the truth. Conclusion. Thank you for joining me on this comprehensive journey through one of the most complex and heart-wrenching cases of our time. We have navigated through the initial shock, the global searches, the false leads, and the cold, hard science. It is a story that reminds us of the importance of truth, the danger of speculation, and the enduring power of hope. If you found this deep dive valuable, please consider supporting the channel so we can continue to bring you these detailed investigations. Until next time, stay safe, stay observant, and never stop seeking the truth. Goodbye.